Is the end of the BBC nigh? Um, I really don't think so, and I've stressed before in the past. I'm a very big defender of the BBC, especially sort of keeping it in its sort of current form. It should always be a public broadcaster, have certainly a degree of independence away from the government, but of course it needs to be properly funded. Um, and the BBC has proved time and time again that it can indeed compete against some of the biggest players out there, especially against American TV with ever increasing budgets. Remember, the BBC, big pioneer, not only in television technology, website technology as well. Some of its websites it made in the 90s heavily pioneered some of the use of Flash animations, all kinds of sort of interactive sort of things that you take for granted now on websites, drop down menus and things like that, pioneered by BBC engineers, sort of people working on the BBC website because they had sort of the funds available to sort of do that. We now take all that stuff for granted. Streaming, remember, the BBC was the first ever streaming platform with its iPlayer. Beat everyone to the punch. And yet now, here we have. And I've said it before, I have disagreed with um sort of the direction of how sort of the BBC sort of has sort of done things in the past. Um I think in terms of sort of its programming, when it puts out, it can indeed put out some of the best sort of programming today. We're going to be talking about Russell T Davies's comments recently, but he said about this, and of course about the future of Doctor Who. So we'll be talking about that in the moment. But if you want a success story, like a really recent success story for the BBC, then you've got to look no further than BBC's Ghosts. Like Ghosts not only has really done well, not only in the UK, but in Europe, but in America as well. Also having one of the very rare swap overs where it has like an American adaptation of it. Again, voila, sort of The Office type thing. But yeah, it is something that we should really look at. And I spoke about this before, that you look at the jobs just that the BBC alone provides in like the creative industry, not only just actually working within the BBC, but companies working under sort of the BBC umbrella, or companies that provide the BBC with stuff. You've only got to look at sort of the infrastructure that's in and around London. You look at up at Salford, Media City, up in Manchester, and what that's provided. Look at Channel 4. Channel 4 sort of very different operating model. That certainly needs to be sort of kept in itself. We talked very recently about the film and independent film stuff that had been announced in the budget. I said, hey, that's quite well. That works out really well. Being able to sort of produce that, and culturally making things like that in the creative industries is something that the UK does incredibly well. Um, I know there was a guy who came on and said he's a producer and sort of rubbished it, but I would argue, and I sort of will push back against him and said, "Hey, look, um, you're telling me that this is somehow bad, when in reality, everything is sort of putting forward. It seems to be quite good. People that I know, certainly in that industry in Sheffield, very sort of celebrating sort of the success in and around that. And of course, he was more complaining about the problems that Brexit had created more than anything else. So there you go. But no, I'm a big supporter of the BBC. I do believe its sort of mission is still as valid as ever. Of course, keeping with the three E's: educate, entertain, and inform, or educate, inform, entertain. I can't remember which way it is, but yeah, the three E's. I think those messages and sort of still very much should still be replicated to this day. And I think the BBC has proven time and time again that it does still have a place sort of in the UK culturally, providing jobs for hundreds of thousands of people, both in film, television as well. And of course, still providing a lot of boost to the technologies within sort of the film and TV industries. Many of them do indeed come from, of course, the BBC. So something that we should really still sort of focus on and look after. I think we should very, very much look after the BBC as an institution. I'm a very, very big supporter of it. So let's go on to see what Russell T Davies had to say about this. But before we do get on to that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, to one updation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. So let's crack on what Davis has had to say. So, according to the head of one of the BBC's most successful franchises, the broadcaster's end is inevitable. Again, I would disagree. I would say that the future for the BBC under sort of a Labour government is probably going to be brighter than ever. And not only just things in sort of, around that, I think that Labour should really, really look at arts funding, having a look at what it can do to really, really bring out the creative industries in the UK, because it is such an incredible sector in the UK. And if it is encouraged, if it is sort of invested in, it can sort of massively provide a heck of a lot of jobs and provide a lot of sort of coffers to the to the treasury. So it's something that should be definitely invested in. Not just sort of things like the BBC, but arts in general should absolutely be a focus. So speaking on a television podcast, they likely to watch Doctor Who showrunner Russell T Davies explained that there was a good reason for the fantasy drama being co-produced with Disney. It means its survival doesn't require the continued existence of the BBC. This, of course, is the temptation. They are trying to Disney's trying to get sort of Doctor Who onto their platform on Disney Plus. So they've said, okay, tell you what, we'll help co-produce, we'll help sort of invest in this. This is something the BBC has done many times before, getting sort of co-production things. We all remember Rome. That was a BBC HBO co-production. They, work together to sort of help fund and produce that. So this type of thing before has happened before, and they have turned out to be very successful. Rome paved the way for the future of things like Game of Thrones and etc. and big budget television. So something to look forward to in a way. So anyway, he continues. He said, you've got to look in the long term at the end of the BBC, which is undoubtedly on its way in some shape or form, said Davis. Is Doctor Who going to die then? No, you've got to prepare for that kind of stuff. Again, I really sort of disagree with this, because again, I think it is more referring to the lack of budget the BBC has, that it has now started to cut its more non-factual budget, because well it's had to, it's been told it's got to. It's had no choice but to. We've seen a reduction as well in new staff as well. That will have, I think, a very sort of big reduction as well. If you sort of listen to sort of The Rest is Politics, you will always hear sort of Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart talk about how the BBC World Service could be a very, very good platform to help sort of spread more sort of the British sort of cultural identity, and sort of spread the word about you know sort of be a good influence and sort of a counterbalance in many things. And I think they're right in that. I think it's something that the current government is sort of missing out on, and we should not be afraid to sort of go in that direction. So he continued. He said, the lack of lavish BBC budgets is another reason that Davis claims that the Doctor Who's future requires Disney's involvement, particularly in a world where the high budget productions are now increasingly norm, as Doctor Who needs to, quote, be up there with the big hitters. And I would disagree. I would say that some of Doctor Who's best episodes have been bottle episodes. I would disagree with him on that. I think necessarily needing a big budget, I don't think you do. Of course, it's nice to have one. You know, it's nice to have one. Or no one would disagree, you know, saying, "Oh, here's an extra, you know, here's an extra couple of million to your budget. You know, go wild with it." No director, TV producer, or anyone in the world would deny saying that, you know, having more money would not be a nice thing. But being able to sort of create um, sort of, you know, good television has always been sort of a hallmark. And of course, Doctor Who traditionally at the forefront of being able to produce good television on very small shoestring budgets. So he continues. So if Disney collapsed tomorrow and we had to go back to making Doctor Who on the normal BBC budget, you know what? We'd all rally around and make it. And suddenly the stories would become all claustrophobic ghost stories, he says. A lot of people would like that very much. So I'm not going to say you have to have this happen, but while it's happening elsewhere, I think it is unfair that it doesn't happen to Doctor Who. Of course, referring to all the very, very much, you know, reduced budgets that's now being sort of going on. So these comments obviously come part of an interview with the podcasters Gough Lloyd and Sarah Brighton on the topics that include camera techniques, script writing, and the unlikeliness of Disney creating a Doctor Who Disneyland style experience. Given that a previous Carvis-based experience was closed due to lack of profitability, costing taxpayers at least 1.1 million, that Doctor Who experience lost a lot of money. Davis also claims that despite the success of Doctor Who's reboot, the BBC doesn't have him contractually tied down. He says it's kind of a rolling contract. It's very free. If I looked at enough to move tomorrow, I could walk out. Well, I wouldn't walk out because I wouldn't let a lot of people down. But nothing could trap me. I would never be in that situation where I'm had to write things. He says, "I'm talking as though this is about to happen. That's not going to happen. I love it. But oh God, never be stuck sitting somewhere going, I must do 5 years here. Nah, I'm too old for that now." Um, yeah, again, he doesn't really elaborate on, maybe he does in the actual podcast, but here he doesn't really sort of espouse on sort of, you know, his reasons why he thinks the BBC is going to fall. And to be honest, there's no reason to think that the BBC currently now is really going to change. And I think honestly, the BBC does have a lot of defenders out there who will fight for it. I know I in the past have said I am a big supporter of the BBC. Doesn't get everything right every time. I will agree to that, but I think keeping the BBC is its way now as a public funded broadcaster is very, very important. And remember, if any way this did get sold off, just someone like Rupert Murdoch buying the BBC, he wouldn't be buying the BBC for its programs or anything like that. He'd be buying it for the prestige. Remember, BBC is a world renowned brand. It has a lot of power, a lot of weight, and a lot of influence. And ultimately, that's what the big media moguls would be bidding to buy, that power and influence that would offer. And I think that going away would be very, very bad. People often talk about how bad the media landscape is now in the UK. I think losing the BBC to a someone like Murdoch, who God knows what BBC News would sort of eventually become. But hey, you know, it's something you do not want to happen, essentially. So I think keeping it as it is, as a sort of a public funded broadcast experience, is something that we should sort of really cherish and sort of look after, sort of as a institution, because again, it provides lots of jobs, provides lots of all kinds of different things, cultural importance that the BBC sort of carries with it as well. So, you know, never say never. But I think it definitely should be kept as a public broadcast. Maybe you can change it in some way, shape, or form. You know, I think definitely sort of the license fee. There's arguments, of course, you've heard before in the past about, you know, ITV wanting a slice of the license fee as well. In the past, they've sort of argued for that, but they're entirely sort of commercial in their dealings. But yeah, we'll see what happens. But I definitely see a future for the BBC. I do not see it sort of collapsing anytime soon. But hey, there you go. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.